All right, good morning. Happy Monday, right? You couldn't say that without laughing. My kids were like, "Why are you laughing?" I'm like, "I don't know, because it's hard to say happy Monday, but it's Monday, right?" I was looking though, I forgot next Monday we have the day off, so something to look forward to, if that helps. I was just double checking before I said it. I didn't want to say it and then have to take it back. But we have today and Wednesday, and then we get Monday next week off. So a long weekend coming, a long hot weekend. I'll stop complaining about it, but it's going to be so hot at the end of this week, which I'm not excited about. Anyway, I hope everyone is doing well. We'll keep going with chapter one today. We didn't get too far, so we'll kind of get more into the history of how we've treated things today and some of that kind of stuff. So definitely getting more through the chapter, probably either all the way through or close to by the end of the day. But a big part of what we focused on last time were those Ds. Anyone remember? Somebody give me one of the 5 Ds of abnormality. What's one of them? Yeah. Distress. Okay, one. Yeah. Deviance, that's two. What's another one? Another, you can check too. Yeah. Duration. You got two more. Yeah. Dysfunction and yeah, danger, right? So those 5 Ds, again, remember that they're not like diagnostic. Okay. So you're not going to look in the DSM or book of all the disorders and see these Ds in there, plus the one before it. But they are kind of like a rough guideline. And they're not perfect, but in general, if we'll have these 5 Ds going on, then maybe, right, we can consider looking at some kind of disorder and those symptoms. So what we'll focus more on today is kind of how have we viewed abnormality in the past? And it's shameful, as I mentioned last time. It's really, really awful. We've done some truly horrible things in the name of trying to help people get better, to arrive at where we are today, and things like therapy. And we were watching I was watching Shutter Island like a couple of weeks ago, and there was this little clip where he kind of listed off all of the things that we did. So I want to play that for you. It's really brief, but I'll play it for you just as kind of an introduction to help people, right? So we literally did things like exorcisms and trephinations and drilling holes in the skull and all sorts of just bizarre things. Spinning people until they passed out was a really common practice. And it was thought that we could almost like force whatever was going on out of the body in some way. But if we go all the way back, the first recorded thing that we have history of is trying to force what we consider to be evil spirits or magical beings out of the mind and out of the body. So in the beginning, or at least the beginning of our recorded like abnormal psych history, we thought that when people had a mental illness, they were possessed, right? So the only way to make it better was to like force the demon or presence out of the body. And we did this through a couple of different ways, and they were both very, very dangerous. A lot of people died during these procedures or during these treatments, we'll say. One of them was called trephination, and that's what you see in this picture of the skull over here, how there's these big holes cut in the skull. We would literally use a stone instrument and a blade, or sometimes like a very sharp thing that we would like hit with a hammer, and we would create holes in the skull to allow the demons to exit. Now, people would suffer massive brain damage, oftentimes die during these procedures, but sometimes when they suffered brain damage, they thought it was a success. Somebody went from really like agitated and loud and flailing and angry to quiet and passive, which was probably brain damage, right? But they considered it successful. Right? So that was a very common practice for a long period of time. You see it featured in like some of the older movies, like From Hell is a good example, where they take something that is almost like the size of this pen and they just slam it into the brain, like all the way around the head, creating these holes for the demons to escape. Much more popular than that was to perform exorcisms. And I won't say these aren't still done today, right? But it kind of comes down to what lens you view something through, whether it's a lens of faith or a lens of psychology. But this was the common practice for a long time. We would coax evil spirits to leave a person's body, usually by using a young priest and an old priest. That's like the formula in every horror movie, right? But with a priest who would do like some kind of ritualistic procedure to get the demon out. And this has been featured in so many movies, right? I think I told you I'm a huge horror movie fan, right? Coming up on, can't wait for the next Conjuring movie next month. I'm already looking forward to it. My daughter's stone cold. This weekend, she wanted to watch The Nun. Like she's never seen it before. She's 13. She's like, I'm ready. And so we watched The Nun and she like went to bed, no problems. I'm in my room with all the lights on. I'm like, wait a minute, it should be flipped here. But anyway, I'm a huge horror movie fan. Here's a few that definitely feature things like exorcisms. And some of them, especially like the exorcism of Emily Rose, which yeah, I have it there in the corner, is all about, is it psychiatry and possession or is it possession? Sorry. So is the whole thing is like a trial of whether this young girl is possessed or has something like schizophrenia. And that's a theme that you see a lot in these movies is trying to figure out which one it is. And oftentimes, as I said, it comes down to what lens you view it through. If you view it through a lens of faith, you might believe that an exorcism would work, right? Kind of like the placebo effect, right? If you view it through a lens of psychiatry, then we're going to go with like medication and something hopefully a little more humane. One movie that, like, again, almost the whole thing is about this theme is the movie The Rite down there on the bottom. There's this whole scene where they're kind of training these new priests to be exorcists, right? And the guy is kind of like a little bit of a rebel, right? He believes also in psychiatry. And I have a little excerpt from that, which I think really gets at that concept. So let me play that for you as well. Oops. Keep forgetting I embedded them in here. Take on mental illness. In the Greek and Roman times, we had a lot of philosophers and physicians. So rather than being more of like a faith-based thing, it became a little bit more medical. Hippocrates is sometimes called the father of modern medicine, and he was the first to propose that things like mental illness maybe had a natural cause to them, like a physical cause, something that we could treat medically, if you will. Now, we didn't still know what to do with this, but it was a very different take. And what he proposed is that we have what he called humors, four different humors that run through our body, these kind of fluids that we possess. The four fluids he proposed were yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. Right? Sounds awful, right? But these four different humors or fluids, and according to Hippocrates, if they were out of balance with each other, it would cause medical issues and psychological issues. So what they would do is they would remove blood from somebody's body and then they would let it settle. And so if I draw like a little, like my best version of a beaker, I have no artistic skills whatsoever. I'll just put that out there now. But if you let it sit, according to Hippocrates, it would settle into four layers. Now we would more say three, but he added a fourth. At the bottom would be the black bile. Now, bile is like a fluid produced by the liver, but according to Hippocrates, if you had too much black bile, then you would have unshakable sadness. So depression, basically, right? So somebody who had like a disproportionate amount of the black bile, we could diagnose with depression, right? Above that, you would have the red blood cells. The red blood cells would translate to the blood. If somebody had a disproportionate amount of blood, we would say they were overly cheerful, which doesn't sound so bad by itself, but maybe we could equate that to like a manic episode or mania now. And depending on what you had, there were treatments for it. So like if you had too much blood, we would bloodlet you. So we'd put leeches on you to remove some of the blood. Really dangerous. Again, people died during things like this as well. If you had unshakable sadness, we would also do methods to bleed you, right? And try and like dilute it through like water and different fluids. Again, not the best form of treatment, but a different perspective. Above that, we had the white blood cells, which would be phlegm. Like snot, right? Like, can you imagine you have too much phlegm? That's your problem, right? And that's going to be diagnostic. With too much phlegm, we said you were lazy, apathetic, right? And the treatment for that, therapeutic vomiting, right? We would give you things like herbs and different tinctures to make you throw up the phlegm to reduce the amount of it in your system to make you feel better. Again, not the most effective, but a different take. And then above that was the yellow bile. And if you had too much yellow bile, then you had like frenzied activity, maybe what we would consider like ADHD today, right? Like you were really like hyperactive and impulsive. And so again, with all of these, it was thought that these fluids should be in balance. If they're not, then it equates to mental illness. And we would do some kind of medical treatment to help make you better. Really, really mixed results. No scientific like support to this whatsoever in a current way. But it was a very, very different take. Instead of like possession and spirits, now we're looking at like medical stuff. And you see this so much in psychology, right? Like we have all these different models or like perspectives. This was a very different idea. Again, completely not grounded in reality as of today. No medical support for this whatsoever. Going forward again, as we get into Europe in the Middle Ages, we go back to possession, right? The Middle Ages and like Europe, we saw a lot of like demonology, a lot of power of the church. And so what we saw again at psychology and psychological dysfunction was the work of devils or like demons. In specific, we went one step farther. It was Satan himself, right? Satan had taken over you and caused you to have mental illness. And so we came up with all sorts of bizarre things. A lot of the like witch hunts and things happened in this period of time. And so we saw these like impossible tests that they would do, often with women, where they would put them at the end of like this long stick and dunk them in the water. If they drowned, well, then they weren't possessed, right? If they didn't drown, they were possessed, and then they'd burn them at the stake. It's like an unwinnable situation, right? And they did this constantly, where they would try and perform exorcisms and bizarre like tests to drive demons out of the body or Satan out of the body. So kind of a return back to that demonology and that focus. A little bit later, the Renaissance is like such a positive period of time. Renaissance means rebirth. And we see a lot of like artistic thought and joy and progress. And in this period of time, there was a doctor named Dr. Johann Weyer who came up with a revolutionary new idea. It was meant to be like the new humane, wonderful idea that would change everything. And it was called an asylum. Asylum means safety. It was supposed to be a place of safety for people who have mental illness. Now, when you picture asylum, when you in your mind like hear that word or picture that word, what comes to mind? Like, do you have images or like things? What comes to mind when you hear the word asylum? Do you have any associations or pictures, images of it? What do you think? Was that a
Yeah, I think of I couldn't think of the name of the movie, but the movie where they're with sorry, I was like
No, you're okay.
with Jack Nicholson where they're in
Oh, over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a
Sure. Okay, what else? Yeah. Yeah, I think straight jackets, yeah.
part of the silence.
Okay, right, good, another good one. Anybody else? Other things you think of? Think of like American Horror Story, was it like season 2 or whatever, like all dark? Like, do you have happy, good, clean, happy images that come up? Like, no, right? Like I think of like darkness, filth, bizarre things, people like in the worst conditions, and that's what these became. Like it was so sad. They were meant to be these big places out in the country. They were often these huge houses in the country where people could go to get asylum or safety and rest to recover. Now, we had no idea how to treat these people, and they often became overcrowded. They would rot in their own filth. They were subjected to horrible procedures and treatments, and they were just awful. They literally became these horrible nightmares of these places, but with the best of intentions behind it, right? They were really meant to be these wonderful places in general. And the most infamous, so famous in a bad way, of these asylums was a hospital called Bethlehem Hospital in London. Now, it started out as Bethlehem Hospital. Over time, it became Bethlehem, and then it transitioned to what they called Bedlam Hospital. Bedlam means chaos or madness, right? So it kind of became synonymous with being mad or chaotic and like problems. But this was one of the most large, grand, like infamous asylums in the world, right? Bedlam or Bethlehem Hospital back in London. There was a whole documentary about this place. I found like a little excerpt from it that I'll play for you. It's like a minute and a half. But this was the most well-known of all of them. And it's still there in a form today, but now it's like a modern hospital with a psychiatric wing. But at the time, it was this huge, massive asylum in London. Huge, right? And then we start getting words like lunatic. lunatic came out of this period of time as well, where it was referring to someone with mental illness. It was thought that it correlated to things like the moon, right? Which is where the word comes from, that we saw higher amounts of like craziness or insanity around periods of full moons. And so we got this term of lunatic that emerged, right, to describe people who are mentally ill. But this was that period of time, sorry, I can go back here, where we were really like obsessed with these different asylums, right? We would lock people away to give them a place of safety and kind of remove them from the common world around them. Right? So it was kind of a twofold thing of removing them from the population, but giving them a place where they could be safe. They just unfortunately did not know how to deal with all these people. And so they became, in an essence, like jails and places where people just died in their own filth. Yeah.
Two-part question.
Yeah.
How was that financed, and was the opening up and the beautification of it, and the desire to attract people, a economic
Like
venture?
motivation or
Yeah,
yeah,
like,
venture.
people see, so they'll give money. If
Yeah.
they pay for that.
Right. And I honestly, I'm not sure. I would assume it was either, I don't know if it was a private venture or if it was like through like the city itself. But I mean, it was the scope of this place was just hard to fathom. It was so large, right? So there had to be quite a few investors. There were doctors who worked there and like earned a lot of money. So I'm sure there was a financial, economic like motivation partially behind it. But I'm not sure who funded it, to be honest.
Because that would be easy to track with the motivation.
Yeah.
Right, like,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
you know, what are you hoping to get for that?
Right. And there was a lot of money involved in this. And you could have a partner, typically a husband could have a wife committed to an asylum for no reason whatsoever. She won't have sex with me. You could have her admitted for having a mental illness, right? Like literally anything. And oftentimes there was a payment that came with that. So there was probably quite a bit of like economic motivation behind it, to be honest. Any other like thoughts, comments, questions, anything else for the moment? Yeah. So they could live there? Ooh, that's probably way less common because again, these places weren't a good place to be. But I won't say it never happened. I'm sure there were plenty of people who just wanted to escape the world. I'm not sure that's a place you would want to escape it to, right? They were really, really awful. It's hard to accurately paint how bad these places were. They were just dark, dirty, filthy, like places. But I'm sure somebody did, right? I'm sure. Yeah. No, no, they were advertised as a place of safety, right? And so oftentimes people had no idea. There was even like almost like a front area that was what was shown to the public. And the rest was very much behind the scenes and private and hidden, right? So no, people often had no clue what these places were. They were just glad that people were away from them in general. Yeah.
Like with like the bloodletting and like really forced asylum conditions, how
Yeah.
do they explain to people that died?
Yeah, the treatment failed. We did the best we could, that kind of stuff, right? But people died all the time or developed new conditions. Like it was so common, even as we get later and we did things like electroconvulsive therapy, people would die during those treatments. It just was very common in the early days for people to not survive these really bizarre treatments we were doing. Yeah. 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 Like you could be cured or treated. It wasn't the norm, right? Oftentimes when people went in these places, they were there for good, right? So oftentimes they were admitted and it was very hard to prove that you were okay enough to be released. So yes, but not frequently. We tried to make things better in the 1800s, right? So again, moving forward, everyone was upset with this idea of like the asylums were obviously problematic, right? Like as we've been talking about. And so there was this new wave of treatment that came forward called moral treatment in the 19th century. So like late 1800s, it was like, okay, we need to treat people with more respect. People who have mental illness deserve respect and guidance. So let's try and improve this situation. Rather than asylums, we're going to create what they called the state hospital. Now, the state hospitals were funded by the states, right? They were funded by individual states. They had better like governmental funding. And they were intended to be driven by moral treatment. So rather than these awful conditions of asylums, we're going to have doctors. We're going to provide the patients with meaningful activities and routines. They're going to be better. And they were better, for sure, right? Better than asylums a little bit. But they still did not know how to cure people. They didn't know how to treat people. So in essence, people were just kind of locked away and trying to give a place where they could rest. But that was about the best that we could do. And these were so popular, like all the way through like the 1980s. State hospitals, even 1990s, I would say, state hospitals were a huge focus of mental health treatment. And there's some really cool paintings that came out of like this period of time. Here's one of them that's really well known. Dr. Philippe Pinel was one of the people who was like a pioneer of moral treatment. So this is at the Paris Asylum for Insane Women. And what they are portraying here is this idea of like, I'm going to remove the chains from patients. In asylums, patients were chained to walls. Moral treatment and state hospitals, we removed the chains. That's the kind of progress we were making. Believing that people shouldn't like be bloodlet and starved and subject to physical punishment, let's treat them by talking to them, by letting them rest. Like these are really very basic new ideas. So this is one very common piece of art that came out of there. The other one, probably my favorite, right? I would love to be a fly on the wall at this dance. It was called Dance in a Madhouse. They believed that as part of this treatment, let's throw big parties for the patients. So they would throw what they called the lunatic ball, right? And every month they would have a huge party around the full moon and let all of the patients get dressed up and dance with each other, right? Really cool. Can you imagine? Like, I want to go. I want to be a little fly on the wall there. I don't want to be one of the patients, but a fly on the wall. And you can see they're portraying them as mad or crazy or being lunatics by having really disfigured faces. Very, very common portrayal in art of this period of time. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these state hospitals ran into the same problems that asylums did. They didn't have enough funding. They didn't know how to help people. And so as we get into like the 1950s and 60s, these were like in their glory days. We saw like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was right in that period of time. But as we got into like the 80s and 90s, they started getting shut down, right? They weren't popular anymore. The idea of like throwing people into a building lost favor. And all of these massive buildings were abandoned, sometimes almost overnight. It was almost like they opened the doors and let everyone out, right? Because they just had no funding to support them anymore. And so these massive state hospitals became things like Cal State Channel Islands, right? For example, my first job in psychology was at a mental hospital in San Diego. And I got to sit in on group therapy. I didn't get paid for it, but it was like the most interesting thing in the world. And I was like 19, so I thought it was amazing. It's now a YMCA, right? Like it just, everything got like shut down and converted. There was all over the country. I got to go to one more up in, it's like near Santa Rosa, a little past it. I took a class in college called, it was Choices and Changes in Buddhism. It was a 1-unit class. And we got to go to this Buddhist colony. And it turned out it was an abandoned psychiatric facility. And I didn't know that before I signed up. And I got there and I was like, this just got so much better. And I was so excited until they made us sleep in the old psychiatric ward, right? And I was so grateful because they separated the boys and girls so they wouldn't be tempted. I got to sleep next to my wife in the room, so it was fine. I was like, oh, I'm so sad. I'm not tempted anymore, right? But I was so grateful to have her because it was terrifying. Like it was in this old like green room with like a lime green tile bathroom. It was so haunted. I swear it was haunted. But there were all these places like this across the country that became repurposed into other things like monasteries, schools, YMCAs, because they just couldn't support this like train of thought anymore. And so I found a really cool montage of these facilities across the country on YouTube. And it's just a couple of minutes and it's set to like Radiohead, which I thought was kind of fun. But I'll play this for you and you can just get an idea of the scope of these places. They were massive, just like the asylum. So
That was it. Still, they were evolving, they were still helping people, but they were not financially helping.
right.
the
So
people in power.
two parts to it, right? So they fell out of favor in terms of like the psychiatric community because it was thought that by removing people from their natural environment, they would never get better, right? Like, so there was a thought that if you took people out for like an immediate period of time, you could recover them from crisis and then release them. but people were put in these facilities for like months, if not years. So that was one problem. The other problem was that there was a lot of economic stuff behind it, right? So all of the funding for these got cut severely, which is why they were released almost overnight. Because it was in some ways kind of similar to what we're seeing now. There was a lot of like funding issues. And so the second that that funding was withdrawn or removed, people were just literally let out, right? So kind of two pieces to it, right? But yeah, I mean, that was a really big part of it as well. Really big part of it. Any other thoughts or comments for the moment at all? But the other thing with these, just like the others that we were talking about a moment ago, featured in a lot of movies and TV shows, right? Asylums and state hospitals. You saw that little clip from Shutter Island earlier. American Horror Story. You mentioned One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Girl Interrupted. We see a few that are a little bit like more like old and creepy, and then some that are a little more modern. But these still exist. But typically, what they are now is like a wing of a hospital, right? So it's like a small little area where people are more like meant for like triage and like emergency care. Rather than long-term, but there are facilities where people maybe might be institutionalized. It's just not a common practice anymore for a couple of different reasons. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
After that, work through that, like, friggin'
Mhm.
like what, like everybody, like, there was like a huge,
Yeah.
boom of like, most people, I think, say, not from state hospitals, I'm just curious, like, if the same kinds of things happen.
Mhm. Yeah, so that Bethlehem Hospital or Bedlam, it went from this massive thing, and they suffered a huge fire, actually multiple fires over the years. Reasons unknown, right? Some mystery there. But that also became like a small wing of a hospital. It's still there today, but it's more of a medical hospital and facility. So what we saw is they were a little bit later than us, but often very like inspired by the events that were happening here. That instead of like their funding being pulled in such a dramatic way, it was just kind of a slower shift, if you will. But yeah, so it kind of followed suit everywhere of not institutionalizing people as much, trying to find better ways to treat people. As we were still trying to figure out how do we help people who have mental illness, because all the way along this, we are still really struggling with the concept of what do we do to help these people, right? And so in the 1950s, what we saw was we moved a lot toward medication and then deinstitutionalization, right? So rather than institutionalizing people, kind of like I was talking about a moment ago, moving toward favoring community treatment, which is more like private therapy, one-on-one therapy, short-term institutionalization rather than long-term. But medication became massive in the 1950s as we developed some of the first antidepressants and antipsychotics that we'll talk about in later chapters. We started moving toward that, like how can we give people medication to maybe make them better? And these medications provided relief that just largely didn't exist before, a whole host of problems that came with them, but medications became very, very popular. There's literally like hundreds and hundreds of these, and we'll talk about quite a few of them throughout the semester. We also started leaning towards therapy. And here's where we saw Europe really playing a big role. People like Freud and Carl Jung and like all these like very like Adler, a bunch of European psychologists very much shaped America's like transition more toward therapy, right? Where we started doing private therapy and even cyber therapy in like more contemporary like ways to try and help people, right? So we're moving toward things like medications and therapy and prevention. Prevention's a big one now. How can we identify risk factors ahead of time and try and catch things before they develop? That is a really big focus of like right now. That along with medication, lots and lots of like current trends with medication therapy and a focus on prevention. Just like it's sometimes a little bit questionable to figure out like what is abnormality, we have the same debate with treatment. We'll talk about lots of different types of therapy and treatment in this class, whether they're medical based or like psychiatric based and therapy based. But clinician Jerome Frank came up with these guidelines, and these are ones we tend to use. We'll talk about some of the common professions in a moment. In general, treatment can be very broad, right? It can account for a lot of different perspectives and takes. It's someone who's suffering, who seeks relief from someone that is a healer. Now, we use healer because that could be a spiritual figure if you're religious. That could be a medical doctor if you believe in like biology more. It could be a therapist. It could be a whole host of different people. We use very broad words for that purpose. The trained, socially accepted healer is accepted by the sufferer, right? So if you are someone who is very religious, you might go to a priest as your healer. If you believe in the biological model, you go to your psychiatrist or a medical doctor. And there's a series of contacts between these two people with the hope of making you better, like working on your emotions, your attitudes, your behaviors, and so on. So just as we'll talk about all sorts of different disorders, we'll talk about all sorts of different treatments and therapies. There are a lot of them, and we're constantly developing new ones, which is also really exciting. But there's just as much disagreement here as there is about how do we decide what's normal versus abnormal, because there are so many different ways that we can treat someone who has a mental illness. And again, something we'll talk about throughout the course of our class. So let's look at some of the like leading like therapy professions. Anyone in here thinking of being like something in the field of psychology? Ideas? Do you have any idea of what? Anyone? You don't have to share, but any thoughts? Yeah. Okay, a clinical therapist. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. I love it. Yeah. Great. Great. And I won't hold you to it. You can choose this, right? Like, yeah. Great. Love it. And that is a wonderful like way to get into the field. Like that was my first like paid psychology job, right? That's a very common one. Anyone else thinking about it? Anyone else want to share?
I just didn't hear what you said.
Oh, sure. And an ABA, an applied behavioral analysis or like behavioral aid, right? A very common like entry level like position, which is great because you get paid to do it and it's great experience. And so lots and lots of different professions, right? Within this like degree area, they're all very degree dependent. You need a lot of education to do all the things that are up here, unfortunately, right? So typically at least a master's degree, sometimes a little bit more, but there are a lot of different jobs that you can do in this field. Before I talk about these, okay, I want you to find a couple of people around you, right? And I'm gonna have you just like jot it down so you don't forget, but you're not turning it in. So go ahead, I'll let you find a group first. So find like 3 or 4 people, just whatever's convenient. And you're just gonna spend a couple of minutes with each other, so kind of turn toward each other. And if you have too many people or less people, it's totally fine, just whatever's convenient. Okay. Okay, so somebody write this down just so you can share. But all I want you to do is come up with when you think about therapy and therapists, right? Therapy and therapists, like in general, like all of these things kind of in general. What are some of the stereotypes or associations that come to mind, right? So when you think about like words or phrases that relate to therapy, therapists, anything related to kind of therapy in general, what are some of those stereotypes or associations that come to your head? So I'll give you a couple of minutes, just anything that you can come up with, write them down, and then we can talk about them together. So it can be things related to like the therapy session, the therapist themselves, anything related to therapy.
Psychology. As important
No, that's fair. I'll give you another minute or two and then we can talk about it together. Again, anything they might say, do, anything in therapy, the therapists themselves, all of it.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
It's like. Unless it's like nice. Like you were.
I always do it like car on the drive.
All right, so like 30 more seconds, and we'll talk about it together. All right, let's go. Let's like kind of see what we came up with. When you think of therapy or therapists, like what are some of the things that come to mind? Give me one. Yeah.
I said, like, something has wrong with something has to be wrong with you.
Okay.
To get there.
Sure.
You can't just see a therapist because you're going to do something. You have to be like, I must be crazy if you want to see a therapist kind of thing. And I think that's a big judgment I to do myself.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't want other people to know, like,
Something's wrong with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really big one, that you must have a problem or something's wrong with you rather than you just want support or someone neutral to talk to, right? Is that a thing for yourself? Yeah.
I'm also kind of. Insecure level. If having this like starting off in the support you and like each other.
Okay.
It kind of almost feels like you're walking.
Yeah. I
So I can imagine.
Yeah. Hard to want to walk into that, right? Yeah.
Something to kind of, you know, these shows you'll see like a therapist who hypnotizes.
Yeah. Really common stereotype too, right? That I'm gonna hypnotize you at some point. I'm gonna either snap my fingers or have a little chain, right, or something along those lines. What else? What else did you come up with? What are some other stereotypes, thoughts? Yeah.
I would say that, well, maybe not so much now, but there's like this thing about
Okay.
like the
Right, definitely kind of similar to that, right? Like a very negative view of needing to go. What else? What else do you picture? Yeah.
kind of talked about the typical terms like how does that make you feel?
Yes. Yeah, that is like the hallmark thing to say, right? Like, how does that make you feel? And the follow-up to that, by the way, is tell me more. Right? Like there was the two, right? Once in therapy, when I was training to be a therapist, one time they said, how does that make you feel? And then I hated myself for it. I was like, I'm sorry. That was so therapist-y of me to say it, right? Like, but people say it, right? Like, let's dig into that, or let's dive into that a little deeper. Tell me more about that. And how does it make you feel? Oh, stereotypical. What else? There was a couple other hands, yeah.
Some people don't think like psychology is a real thing or that therapists are not real doctors.
Sure. Yeah, kind of discrediting the whole thing. What else? Yes, right, and we'll look at those in chapter 3, right? You're gonna look at Rorschach blood tests and tell me what you see and like all the weird things in it, right? That's another really common one. What do you picture in the therapy room? What has to be in that therapy room? Right, the couch, right? Like the James lounge couch. Freud invented that, by the way. Like that was a Freud's thing. He would sit behind his clients or patients and have them lay down on the couch. What else do you picture in a therapy office, stereotypically?
Sure.
Ooh, I like that. I've never had a therapist with candy, but I would have candy if I was there. Right, I like that. Right. What else in the therapy room? Like, what else are you gonna see in there? Do you have any other things that can remind me? Okay, things to draw. I picture degrees on the wall, right? Like as if they're trying to give themselves credibility. Like, here's all my degrees. Like, I swear, I know what I'm doing. What?
That's really true. Another thing is you see someone just writing all the time.
Yeah.
Some do that and some will like intently listen to you. So you have your kids, like not all of them are right.
Yeah.
Nobody writes anymore. They're all on the
Right? Like they're gonna take notes, the bobblehead, like, nodding and like, like over and over again. What else? Anything else come to mind? There's another hand or two. Things you picture, things they're gonna say. Anything else? Trying to think if I have any other ones that, my therapist, right, and I don't mind normalizing, I've gone to therapy for years, right? Like I had to go to therapy as part of training to be a therapist. And something that a lot of people don't know, when you're in the program to become a therapist, they reward you for going to therapy yourself by counting every hour you go to therapy as double. Okay, so you have to do 3,000 hours of practice hours before you can take the licensing exam. If you go to therapy, 1 hour equals 2, right? So they really want you to do that so that you can normalize it and that you also get that experience. My therapist always says, and it would make me so mad every time, don't forget to practice self-care. Every session, don't forget to practice self-care. And I just look at her like, really, I'm gonna go have a piece of cake. Okay, it became self-cake, which is why I was like, I'll go practice self-cake later. And then I wrote a book about self-care and I was mad about it, right? Like, but you would always say that. I always picture that I had someone say it over here, that they can't turn it off, right? That I have friends that I went through the program with, and no matter when I see them, they're always like, right? Like, it's like they're always in therapy mode. They can't take the therapist hat off. That's kind of obnoxious sometimes. Sometimes it's nice. I picture that they have problems themselves, right? That they went into therapy and became a therapist because they have issues. And they're like, I can help other people because I have issues too.
Maybe this might come to mind as well, it's like couples counsel.
Okay.
And then I feel like there's always like, I guess from that sense, there's this notion that like both talk about your feelings and your emotions and conflicts, and usually there might be some resistance to it. But like, I mean, like, I guess in order to go, you have one, at least one partner would like want to go.
Sure. Couples counseling is fascinating. It was my least favorite and most favorite at the same time because it got so heated so fast. I'm like, they're going to kill each other on the way home. But it was so interesting. We'll look a little bit at couples counseling as well. But yeah, that's another one. I think of the word shrink, right? Have you ever heard that word before? And I think that stereotype alone sums up how we feel about therapists. Like, to call someone a shrink, the way where that came from. So it came from the term head shrinker, which was a disparaging reference comparing the process of therapy to the primitive tribal practice of shrinking the heads of your enemies. Okay, so that's kind of like what we tend to think of therapy in our culture. You're gonna go see a shrink who's literally gonna shrink your mind, right? Like, I mean, it's just, we tend to have some very negative stereotypes of therapy, and they can obviously be true, but they can also not be, right? It can be an incredibly helpful like endeavor for people and a wonderful profession to be in. And there are lots of different options within it. The top three, and the three I wrote up here, are kind of the most common that people pursue. So just to break them down a little bit more in case you wanted a little more information, let's look at these a tiny bit. So counseling, clinical, and psychiatry. They're all different, but we tend to kind of use the term therapist to represent all of them. They all have a different, we start with their education. A counseling psychologist has a master's degree. Didn't mean to capitalize that, sorry. They have a master's degree. So typically that takes 2 years after your BA, 2 to 3 years. In California, a counseling psychologist is typically called an MFT, a marriage and family therapist, right? So on average, a master's degree, which is like 2 to 3 years. A clinical psychologist has a PhD. Right, so they have more education, which takes like 5 to 7 years on average after a bachelor's degree. They make more money as a result, right? But they tend to have more education. A psychiatrist has a medical degree. Right, so most education of all, 7+ years. All right, and none of those include the internship that comes after, where you do thousands of hours before you can take your exam to be qualified to get your license. They all have a slightly different focus as well. So a counseling psychologist, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. PsyD is typically clinical. It's kind of a weird gray area in between the two. PsyDs, a lot of people will go for them because it's less than this, but more than this. But it ends up where you're kind of here, but you typically, it's kind of like a gray area that often isn't viewed as equivalent because it's less than a PhD. So it's in between the two. So it'd be like right here, right between the two. But the work that they do will be probably about the same. So their focus on everyday problems, anxiety, depression, stress, couples work, right? Kind of like everyday sort of stuff, versus people who are clinical psychologists tend to deal more with like disorders that are more severe: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. There's oftentimes kind of an overlap between what the two do. But if somebody is more severe, they typically go to a clinical psychologist because they have more education and more training. Okay, so it might be that someone here ends up referring them to someone with more expertise. Anyone know what the focus for a psychiatrist is? It's one thing: medication. When you go see a psychiatrist, they often only focus on medication, right? Their appointment length is very brief. It's like 20 minutes, typically. So appointment, right? You go into them, it's like 20 minutes. How are you tolerating the medication? What are your symptoms? How are you feeling? Very, very short, very focused on the medication. They have a medical degree, so that's what they focus on. Very common that someone sees a psychiatrist plus one of these two, right? So you're doing like therapy over here and then medication with the psychiatrist. Both of these two, it's 50 minutes. The therapy hour is 50 minutes, typically. Right, so you go in and you have like a 50-minute session where you're typically going to talk through things, work through things, maybe do some kind of like examination of thoughts or behaviors or feelings. Right, so slightly different focus. The money they make, a little bit different here. So these are, I looked this up just the other week. So this is in California in 2025. Okay, so very recent. On average, counseling psychologists make $107,000 a year. On average. This can get way higher if you see a lot of clients, or way less if you see less. Also, depending on where you're practicing, like in a very wealthy area versus a like more like less wealthy area. Clinical, 126. So they make a little bit more, you would hope, right? Because you have more student loan debt to pay off after all that school, right? You make a little bit more. This can have a huge range, right? If you specialize in a very specific area, you might make upward of like 200,000 a year, right? Depending on like your clientele. Psychiatrists make so much more money, 256,000 on average. And again, that's like the middle number, the median, right? There are people who make way, way more and people who probably make way less. So with these three, the work that these two do is about the same. right? Psychiatrists, completely different entities. So again, pretty common that someone would see one of them plus the psychiatrist. Yeah. Yeah. The variability in those salaries, it's so all over depending on what you do. So it's really hard to qualify. But there are a lot of people who are clinical researchers. So they conduct experiments. They're doing things like to gather information. Tons of people in that realm. They tend to be kind of more in here, the closest to this, oftentimes requiring a PhD as well. Sometimes just a master's, but typically a PhD. You can also be a school psychologist who works in a school setting, right? So those require a master's degree as well, usually 2 to 3 years. And then you're working with students, you're doing a lot of assessment, aptitude tests, intelligence tests, placement, working with like disorders and different kinds of like learning disabilities. And then social workers work more with like the institutions. So you're often connecting like a family with a school, with a doctor, and like connecting a bunch of resources together, sometimes doing therapy, sometimes more out in the field, kind of a little more variability in these last three than you see with the first three. Yeah.
Can you do another layer of years of education on each?
Oh, yeah.
How many hours of clinical work that you have to do? Is it different between the masters and the?
So this one is, like I said, it's usually 2 to 3 years is a master's degree. All right, so 2 to 3 on average. Mine was 2, but then you have to do a thesis. I did mine within the 2. Some people, it takes another year. PhD is typically 5 to 6 years, and MDs are 7 plus. Okay, and then on top of that, you have to then train for your licensing exam, which is like thousands of hours typically, depending on the state and what you want to do.
And what's the licensing hour difference between
It-
counseling and clinical?
It depends. So it depends what you want your specific licensure in. Both of these are typically 3,000 hours. Okay. Now it depends a little bit. Like if you want like a specialty area, it might be more. Different states have different requirements. So this is California. This one, I forget what the number of hours. It's different depending on your specialty. Psychiatry becomes more complicated because you have to do a rotation in a hospital as a medical doctor. And then you also do your rotation on top of that in a specialty related to psychiatry. So it tends to be really dependent on what you want to do, but it's more than the 3,000 hours, right? When you add the medical part plus the psychiatric part. So again, a little bit more variability.
I've never heard this term psych. What is psych?
PsyD, right? So it's, yeah, so it looks like this. So PsyD. So it's typically considered what it's called an academic degree. So a lot of people who have PsyDs become researchers or work as a professor. And so it's more based on like academic than counseling. So for example, my degree is in counseling. I have a master's in counseling psychology. With that, I could have been an MFT. I did 2,200 hours of the training. So I was getting there, right? But I found that I loved teaching and I didn't love counseling as much. There was like a very clear moment for me. And I think I'm glad I paid attention to it. I would stare at the clock when I was teaching and wish I had more time. And I would stare at the clock when I was counseling and wish it was over. And like for me, like in my gut, that just told me a lot. And so like I found I kind of gravitated one way over the other. But like most people who know they just want to teach, just want to be in an academic realm, they might consider something like a PsyD. But those aren't very popular programs. There aren't as many of them. It's kind of like a weird gray area in between.
You have to do a thesis with a master.
Yes.
You have to do a thesis with a master's and the clinical.
Yep.
Are they comparable?
Yeah, right. Typically this one's a little more involved, right? But yeah, they can be comparable. Like my master's thesis is like 198 pages or something like that. It was so long. It took a year to do, right? And that's typically the case with both of them. These two are very similar, right? They're often what we would call a therapist, right? It could be either. But it depends on your specialty area and your education.
Why would you pay?
Yeah.
To go to school for however many more years so that you can say that you're
Yeah.
a doctor?
A lot of people like to have the title. I'm actually the only full-time here who doesn't have a PhD, but I have the exact same ability to do this as my colleagues. I'm probably less student loan debt, right? So like, it was fine. Like I could have kept going, but I felt like I had the education to do what I wanted. And so I stopped, right? But you could go either way. The work these two do, ultimately it's very similar. Yeah. And the requirement's pretty similar too. So I think that's the last. I had a book to recommend to you. I tried to do this in every chapter or whenever it was relevant. If you're interested, there are so many wonderful like books related to this topic, right? I'm a big reader. My partner's an English teacher, so I have to read, right? Like I finished a book over the weekend. I was like, look, I did it. Right? I was like, be proud of me. Right? I'm a slow reader, but Myth of Normal, really interesting book that came out just a couple of years ago. All about this idea of like what is normal anyway, and kind of dissecting that a little bit in our culture. So I'll leave this chapter on this note if you're interested. And I have some other recommendations like this along the way as we get into like the disorders. But I'll leave that up there for you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, apart from psychiatrist, a growing profession is nurse practitioner.
Yeah.
It's like less years, and it's still not years.
Yeah.
NP, and then we do
Right.
another like 2 or 3 years on top of that to become NP in psychiatry, but like they do the same thing.
They do. And you can prescribe medications and things here. So it's kind of like in between the two. My 11-year-old, my daughter Emma, looked at me over like 2 weeks ago and was like, I want to be a nurse practitioner as a psychologist. I was like, perfect, I can help you with that. I was all excited. She was excited. I was excited. It'll probably change next week, but like it was cool anyway. That is another like spot you can do. There are so many other, these are like the big ones, but you could be a forensic psychologist. You could be a neuropsychologist. You could be focused on developmental. There's so many little areas, but typically people will get like a broad degree and then specialize from there. And so oftentimes people have areas where they consider themselves like an expert in. Like I have a lot with like trauma, EMDR, IFS work, like, and then gender and sexuality. Like, so people often have an area of focus with like a broad degree, and then other professions like that one too. All right, so I'm going to stop here, but I want to take attendance. Like I said, I'll take attendance this week and then never again. So today and Wednesday, and then we'll be done with that. So let me just get through this one more time. It's too much time. And again, keep correcting me or letting me know if I like mess it up or if you want to go by something else. And next class, we'll start chapter 2. So chapter 2, the slides are up, is all about the different models of abnormality. So what are all the different approaches we can take and different ways within viewing disorders? Again, 2 more chapters of setting the stage, then we get to the disorder. All right, Jennifer, Jetsiri, yeah. Addison, Becca, Ovid,
Here.
Mia, here. Anna, here. Gabriel,
Here.
Sarah, here. Heidi, Rear, yeah, sorry, Maura, here. Rowan, here. Margaret, here. Emma, here. Malia, Peter, here. Aiden,
Here.
Ian,
Here.
Danny, Olivia, here. Ella, here. Wanda, here. Jamie, here. Troy, Andrea, here. Saoirse, here. Raphael, here. Jacob, Emily. Here. If I just printed this right before class, so if I didn't call your name, come check with me because that means you're not in yet. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of the day. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Anything else?
I'm good. Thank you so much.